when did you know that this was the career for you in journalism?
I knew I wanted to be a broadcaster from a very young age. I always was fascinated with journalism, and I'm one of the lucky ones that, starting as a third or fourth grade kid, I would be walking around the playground at school. We had something called a Mr. Microphone,
Oh,
which
sure.
was a microphone with a big antenna on it that would connect into like an FM radio so you could broadcast. And I would bring the microphone to school and interview kids on the playground and like make up news stories and do reporting like that. So I did all the normal things that wannabe journalists do. We had a school newspaper in middle school, we had a school newspaper in high school, and all of that kind of led me to where I am. My college had a student run TV station. So we were doing newscast every day at Marquette University in Milwaukee. So I've always known that I wanted to be a broadcaster. I do distinctly remember sitting in my family's living room watching the uprising at Tiananmen Square, beaming from around the world into my suburban Chicago home. And there was a young producer for Nightline who was narrating what was happening. And at the time they were using satellite phones. It pales in comparison to the way it would be covered today, but it was still magical to me. I love history, and the idea of helping write the first draft of history as it happened was very appealing to me.
Very cool. Very cool. As a student journalist, is there like something that really stuck out to you? Something's memorable?
It's so well, I remember the first story I did for my student newspaper in high school, where I was assigned to go cover a cross country meet. And I was a freshman. I didn't know anything about cross country. So I ran the warm up lap with the kids on the team, which I look back and I'm like, the story was like this long. Like I have no idea why I thought like I needed to immerse myself and figure out what exactly these guys were going through. And I'm sure the story was very stupid and very obvious, but I do remember that running with the cross country team. It's a good instinct to want to
Yeah.
understand what your story subjects are going through, but also so silly looking back at it. Young journalists today, especially student journalists, are really doing incredible reporting based on their school. That really isn't the way that we saw student journalism. And I mean, our newspaper, every once in a while, we covered something that was, a real issue, but mostly it was like very basic what's going on in the school, interview a couple people. You know what I mean? Today, I think because young people started doing storytelling at such a young age with Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok. So when it comes to student media, I really feel like young people today are doing much better journalism than we ever did. We just didn't think it was an option. It wasn't like we were afraid or the administration was going to shut us down. Uh, it just was different. It was
Yeah.
different.
Sure. Yeah. Very cool. Very good to hear. I know a lot of student journalists out there right now are, especially in Minnesota, because they're not protected, are really
Nope.
kind of
Right.
struggling with that fear of whether they could be shut down. But
It's
um
tough. I mean, I really admire the way that young journalists are bringing journalism to the table. The challenge is there is a different view of journalism from younger reporters today, and it's sort of an activist journalism. And all journalists, part of why you go into journalism is you have this ridiculous idea that if you expose the truth, people will take in the truth, act on it in a rational manner, and make society better. So we're all sort of do-gooders in a way, right? We believe in the power of truth and that shining light makes a difference. Um, what is slightly different today is that I think, especially young journalists, but I hear this from like Star Tribune editors when they're trying to hire people. that it is rare to find people who really go in with a blank slate saying, let's find out everything we can about something and then lay out the facts. There's much more of an activist bent. And I'm not, is that good? Is it bad? I don't know. It just is. Like, it's different than the idea that I always had as a journalist, which was, all right, like let's see what we learn. You know, I broadcast live on our streaming service the trial of Derek Chauvin, and I covered and anchored every second of that trial. And going into the trial, coworkers would ask me, "Well, you think he's guilty, right?" I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm going into this like a juror. I want to take it all in. And if you ask me honestly, at the beginning of the trial, I thought that perhaps Derek Chauvin was overcharged for what he did. And by the end of the trial, I was absolutely convinced without question that he was guilty on everything he was charged with. That's what it's supposed to be. You come in with an open mind, you listen to the whole facts, all the facts, you bring in context. So you're not just a stenographer, you're not a court reporter, but you talk to other people, you bring your own historical context, your own knowledge, your own legal experts, all of that. And then you lay it out. And I love doing that. I love it.
Find
You
the
know, I
story instead of
find the story.
yeah.
I know there's a good trend away from kind of both sidesing everything. We don't need to give the other side of climate change. We know it's happening. We don't need to interview someone who says it's not. There are things that are just truth, and we don't need to both sides that. But I will say, like, I spent a year coaching the debate team at Maple Grove High School, and when you're forced to figure out the rational arguments for the other side, it makes you a better thinker. And in fact, it can strengthen up your previous opinion sometimes. And sometimes you look at it and say, huh, I think I was wrong. Or I think I didn't kind of fully understand how complicated the issue is. That's often where I end up. Like, the things are usually more, if it's controversial, there's a good reason it's controversial. It's because it's not an easy answer.
Hmm.
Most of us want the same things ultimately, but the way you get there is sort of, that's where the fun stuff is. Like, it's often nobody knows until you do it. So
Yeah. Awesome. Very cool. Um, what was the transition like from TV to radio?
it was thrilling and horrifying and uncomfortable and gratifying. I spent 30 years or so doing the same thing, doing television journalism. In the last 10 years, anchoring a morning show. To go to opinion radio, which is what I'm doing now, is a big change. I think most people think that journalists really do have opinions, that we're just covering it up. Um, and sometimes that's true. I mean, your job is to explore issues without kind of locking in on your own opinion. What I found is I had a lot of uh, dinner party opinions, like 30-second, 1 minute opinions. It's quite different to drive a 10-minute segment sharing your opinion. Uh, and so I also had the luxury of really not having an opinion on a lot of things. So that's been really interesting, starting from scratch, not being a Republican or a Democrat, and saying, all right, let's look at this issue and see what we think. It's been fun, um, but I had to learn a different way of storytelling. So in television journalism, you know, I would have a number of different techniques in my toolbox of ways to tell a story, right? Maybe you start with something personal and then broaden it out to the bigger issue and then lay out some solutions. Or maybe you're just telling something that happened and we all like to tell a story in a certain narrative arc. Like, maybe even a TikTok video often has rising action, conflict, uh, and then resolution. a 15-second TikTok usually has that sort of arc to it. TV stories do as well. Radio doesn't quite work like that. So I need to start with my opinion right away, then back sell the information. Like, what am I talking about? How do I support it? And then get back to my opinion. So it's sort of a weird arc in storytelling, but the reason you need to do it is because a lot of listeners are on streaming devices. And so AM radio goes out live on AM. If you're listening on the HD channel on the FM, it's about 20 seconds delayed. If you're listening on Amazon Alexa, it's about 90 seconds delayed. So for the listeners to catch up and then be able to call or text in or interact, you have to kind of tell your stories in sort of an interesting way. When I started filling in on radio 10 years ago, and people would react to a well-framed question. So you ask the audience a good provocative question, force them to think in a way they hadn't before, serve up some low-hanging fruit that they can just react to. Now they want to hear what I think, and then they tell me if I'm right or if I'm wrong. It's sort of a social media thing, I think. People are
Mhm.
used to, like, here's the tweet or here's the Facebook update, and then they react. So it's sort of like that on radio too.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of
It's fun to not have to wake up at 2:30 in the morning. I spent the last 10 years waking up at 2:30.
oh,
It's fun to
sure.
not wear makeup. It's fun to not have to wear a suit every day. Although I did go out and buy some suits to wear for fun. Because it's different. It's different when you dress up for fun versus dressing up for work.
Yeah.
The biggest change is radio is a very individualized sport, and TV is a team sport. And
Mhm.
so, one of the things I enjoyed very much about TV is that you'd have a producer working overnight, you'd have a writer, you'd have a manager. You had, in the morning anyway, we had two photographers, two reporters, two, two anchors, a weather person, and then you'd have the crew. So you'd have the director and the audio operator and the floor director, the RoboCam operator. So you had all of these people, not a ton. We were still really small. There were like 15 or 20 people involved in putting the morning news on it at WCCO. But now it's just me and a producer. So it's just two of us. And I do miss the team aspect of it. I'm doing some marketing too. So, like, I also am uh, television news, for obvious ethical reasons, doesn't want your news anchor getting paid by Target or Best Buy or some other company. So the TV station essentially owns you when you work for TV news. Radio is different in that part of my job on the air is doing endorsements for companies. So when I started in radio, I reached out to some companies that I had been a customer of or had a relationship with or knew the owners to try to get my endorsements that were people that I really believed in instead of like the sales department just giving you something. But then I also am allowed under my contract to do social media marketing. So I've done influencer videos, influencer projects, brand ambassador projects. So that's been super interesting learning that side of digital media too.
Sure. Very cool. Yeah, you kind of have your hands in in many different spots of the media world.
It's a hustle. Like, I know, especially a lot of young people really aspire to be an influencer. And I can tell you, like, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Like making a compelling Instagram reel for a brand. And I have 30,000 Instagram followers or something, 30,000 on Facebook. So maybe I'll charge, $1,000. And you're like, as a TV person, I was like, wow, I could make $1,000 in 5 or 6 hours of work. And then you start doing it, you're like, that 5 or 6 hours of work is like really 15 hours when you think about the thinking about it, the editing, the driving to wherever you're going to shoot. Now, I'm not saying it's not good money, but think about how many times you have to do that to make an actual living. Like
Yeah.
there's something to be said for going to work and they give you a paycheck. It's,
Yep. Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yep. Yep. I get that. I guess that kind of leads into the question I had was, which was, uh, journalism's kind of evolved a little bit with that social media element. First of all, how important do you feel it is for a new journalist to kind of understand social media, and have
Uh,
a
it,
presence
it,
on social media?
yeah, it's interesting. I got involved in Twitter, I don't know, 14 years ago. I joined the day after the 35W bridge collapsed. I was out there covering it, and friends were using Twitter when the text network went down that night because it was overwhelmed from everyone texting everyone to see if they were okay. So I joined the next day. My first tweet was like back covering everyone has these fun first tweets, and mine was like covering the 35W bridge collapse again. I always did it because I like social media. I like engaging. Uh, Today, if I were a new journalist, I'm not sure I'd recommend that you get on Twitter. I recommend you get on Twitter to use it as a research tool, but the risk of screwing up your career by tweeting something that you think is funny that the internet decides is evil, um, I don't know that it's worth it. It is an incredible research tool. I mean, think back to what journalism used to be like. I spent a lot of my career doing man on the street interviews where you'd go up to someone, explain a story to them, and then ask them what they think. It's a ridiculous process because the person you're talking to may or may not care about what you're talking about. You may or may not have done a good job of explaining what the story is. So they're really reacting to your explanation of the story, not the actual story. Social media allows you to get to people who are directly affected by these things. So kind of the input you get from affected people is so much richer now. It's so much more relevant. So from that side, it's really good. It's impossible to have like a personal and a professional because someone always can screen grab it. So you have
Mhm.
to act like whatever your social media is your professional social media. I've just seen too many careers get, you
Mhm.
know, people get canceled. And sometimes you look and say, well, you deserved it. But
Yeah.
often you think, why? Like the the station's not paying you anything more for this. Like the whoever you work for, I actually think it's a major labor issue. You get sort of pressured to do it by your bosses, but they provide no safety net. And so if you screw up, uh, the liability is all on you. It's
Sure.
like they're not giving you what are they doing? Nothing. They're pushing you to do it. They're getting all of the benefit of it, and that people are, seeing your content in other spots. I just question if it's worth the risk.
Sure. Sure.
Do you need to be there? Yeah, like I think if I were hiring someone and they had no social media presence, I'd be like, are you living in this society? Like it's strange. But I think younger people already are moving to a more like peer-to-peer Snapchat type communication. I know my high school kids, like they barely post anything on Instagram, an occasional story, but they're mostly living in Snapchat land.
Sure.
So
Sure.
we'll see aren't you curious? Like, what's it going to be like in 5 years when these high school students are out in the work world?
Oh,
Like, who
yes.
knows? Will
Yeah.
Twitter be around? I don't know. Will Threads replace it? I don't know. Like, I do think for breaking news, Twitter's unbelievable and nothing comes close to it.
Sure.
Uh, for fun, I love Instagram. Facebook always kind of, even though like young people are like, I never use Facebook. Like the only thing I ever post articles on that people like click and go read it is Facebook.
Mhm.
I appreciate that. Like, thank you for reading what I'm doing. Like,
Yep.
so I don't know. It's all very, it's fun for me. And certainly it's an incredible research tool when you're a journalist.
Broadening that out, where have you seen changes in journalism, and maybe where do you see it heading?
We have seen this kind of growth of nonprofit, sort of opinion leaning journalism. So, like Alpha News is unabashedly conservative in their viewpoint, but what they're doing is reporting. So they're breaking news, they're finding stuff. Same is true at the Minnesota Reformer, where they're unabashedly left wing, and their reporting is excellent. So that's been a very interesting sort of new-ish development over the last couple of years. You have uh, outfits like MinPost that are kind of reader supported, Racket, which is a bunch of former City Pages people. That's pretty interesting. So that's been a big change. The biggest change we've seen, like in television journalism, is the rise of the MMJ, the multimedia journalist, the one man band is what we used to call it. It's the reporter who also is shooting the story and editing the story. And it used to be you would go get your first job in Mankato, where you were a one man band. And then you'd move up and get your second job in Madison, Wisconsin. And then you'd go to Milwaukee. And then you'd come to Minneapolis. And you wouldn't have to shoot your own stuff in Milwaukee or in Minneapolis. Now, everyone that gets hired in Minneapolis is expected to at least sometimes shoot their own stories. I don't think that's going away. I think TV stations would prefer to have, you know, 20 people who can go on the air and shoot instead of 10 people who can go on the air and 10 people who can shoot. So it's simply a money thing for them. So that's a big change. We've also seen a sort of flattening of salaries. So it used to be like you get your first job, you make, like for me, my first job was in Rockford, well, it was sort of a part-time Rockford, Illinois, but my first full-time job was Davenport, Iowa. This was in 1997. I was paid $18,000 a year, $9 an hour, which was actually a pay cut from my summer job working at a swimming pool, but that's what the pay was. Now my rent was $440 a month for my two-bedroom apartment. So, you could live on it, but it was tight. I had to go to the ATM machine, put my credit card in, take cash out to be able to pay my rent 1 month. But with each job, your salary would sort of go up. It would maybe double. So like then I went to Milwaukee and made like 40,000, came here, made 68,000 in 2003. And I was like, $68,000. Like this, I'm set. Well, for 20 years, I think we're still hiring people for that or less. So salaries have sort of flattened, which means Minneapolis is hiring kids from their first job. So we're becoming a second job market when we used to be a fourth job market. So sometimes if you watch the news and you're like, it's children on the news.
Yeah.
It's that's why. It's because the salaries have sort of flattened. So if you're in Milwaukee making 55, are you going to come to Minneapolis for 65? Probably not. So that's been a change too.
That's
Now the quality of journalism, in some ways, it's incredible because the young people who are starting today have been telling visual stories since they were 5. So they're just native to this form of storytelling. In other ways, because some of the veterans like me are leaving, I feel like there's more turnover of the veterans happening. So the younger people just don't have as many examples to look to. I mean, I learned how to become a journalist from consuming journalism and from sitting next to good journalists and watching people do their jobs. And you're like, oh, like I never thought to make that phone call. I never thought to make that documents request. And that's how you learn. And so it does concern me a little bit that, the turnover and the workload and, the trend is fewer people more output, same pay. So it's not different than most corporate type jobs, but like the economic outlook is not great. That said, when I was in college, uh, in what now, 30 years ago, they were predicting the end of local news. Like local TV stations are going to shut down. We're not going to need it anymore. It'll all be digital. And local TV stations in Minneapolis, we have four of them,
Hmm.
adding more and more content. And why are they adding more content? Because it's cheap, but it also means there are jobs. Like, and those TV stations are making money. So you wouldn't have four TV stations doing local news in Minneapolis. All of them are making money. So, what's the timeline? I don't know. If I had to predict the future, at some point, you're not going to have four TV stations doing local news. You'll have one or two doing essentially a news wheel around the clock. You see that on CBS Minnesota, the streaming version of WCCO. They take their newscast and chop it up. And sometimes they're doing streaming exclusive, like from 7 to 8 a.m. They do streaming news. But then they just take their newscast and chop it up. And so you can go to the streaming channel and there's local news all day. Um, will that be the future? I don't know. It's up to the young people. Like, what do they want to consume? Most of us, you sort of age into watching the news when you hit your 40s and you have kids and your kids are old enough that you're not like losing your mind trying to put them to sleep, you start watching the news. It's just sort of how things go. Will it continue to go that way? I don't know. With TV, we've seen the 10 o'clock news, which used to be king in Minneapolis. Now it's the 6 o'clock news. So the 10 o'clock news still gets good audience, still a big thing. But because people are watching streaming video and Netflix and whatever at night, um, you know, they forget to turn on the news at 10, or they're watching a streaming show that they started at 9:20 and they're still watching it at 10:15. So the 5 and 6 is still more people are home making dinner or whatever, and they're still watching the news. So those things will keep changing. Morning news, we used to see people waking up earlier and earlier and earlier. And we had big audience from 4:30 a.m. until 5:30 a.m. Now, um, COVID and work from home changed viewing habits. And so nobody's watching at 4:30 anymore because people aren't getting up that early to go to work. So like that has changed. So things change, and sometimes you have no idea until you're like, whoa, that's a major change.
Sure. Like, what's your advice for student
Mm.
journalists entering the field?
Be curious and have a broad view of what things you're interested in. I never would have guessed that I would be anchoring a morning news and I would go from interviewing the governor or interviewing the mayor to doing a cooking segment to a workout segment to interviewing a small business owner. And then you've got a juggler, and all of this happening within 3 hours. Um, the trend is towards really being uh, very narrow focus. I'm interested in politics or world affairs or whatever. I would just say it's fine to really focus in on something, but you're a much more valuable journalist if you are really curious about everything. And if you go in with that curiosity, that will guide you to the right place at all times. Don't be afraid to ask for help. A lot of people think like, oh, I want to do it on my own. Ask for help. People are incredibly and surprisingly helpful. Ask for feedback and actually take the feedback. When someone sends me work, whether it's a print article, an online thing, or a visual story, I always have to ask first. I'm like, do you really want feedback, or do you want me to make you feel better about your work? And either choice is valid. Sometimes you need a little kind of pat on the head. That's all right. But if you really want to grow, you have to be willing to analyze your own work.
Okay. Awesome.
Don't be too obsessed about what college you go to. Like just get experience. So internships, student media, start your own blog, do news stories and put them on YouTube. All those experiences really add up.
Very
So
good.
I recommend Marquette. Yeah, I loved it. I majored in political science and in broadcast and electronic communication, which was our sort of visual storytelling major back in the day. But the biggest thing we had at Marquette is as a freshman, you could get involved at the student TV station, MUTV. And so I had other students teaching me how to edit, how to shoot, how to do an interview right away as a freshman. So I learned more from fellow students than I did from my faculty.
What was your most memorable day in the newsroom?
Mm. It was for sure the 35W bridge collapse. I can remember every single second of that day. From the moment I was sitting at my desk in the newsroom when the first scanner call came over, because I was supposed to be doing a story about the farmers market being canceled because it was so hot in the drought and we were waiting for farmers to come in from the field. And the call came in that the 35W bridge collapsed. And we didn't even know, like, what is the 35W bridge? Like, it wasn't a memorable part of our infrastructure. Um, we had no photographers in the building. So I just left. I was like, I'm going to walk over there. Um, and there was a photographer sitting in the parking on the driveway, running out his shift. It was like 6:10, and he was supposed to work till 6:30. So he was just waiting to go home. In Northeast Minneapolis, his path would have taken him across the bridge. So Brad Early's sitting there. I open his door. I'm like, did you hear the 35W bridge collapse? He's like, no. I'm like, let's go. So I get in the car and we head over there. And there's an eerie feeling when you arrive at a scene and you hear the sirens behind you. So we got there so fast. And I just remember people carrying people up that hill by the Red Cross, by the Mississippi River. And, you know, people asking for water and so I'm on the phone. Like if you go on YouTube, you can hear my first report at like 6:25 that night. So I just remember everything about that day, every second, every interaction, every person I interviewed. And that was a long time ago and it
Yeah.
still sticks with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of those events.
Today, I would say, like at the time, it really messed me up. Like we have a much better understanding today that journalists are first responders and can have some of the same mental health trauma. At the time, there wasn't really that kind of sophisticated understanding of it. We were just, how dare I have trauma from this? I was just observing, like, think of all the people who are really in it. But I think today we have a better understanding of the fact that journalists go through that stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah. I show my students a video about journalists reporting during 9/11 in New York. There's
9/11.
a
Yeah.
pretty good video that kind of touches on that, and we chat about that in our class. But it is an important topic for them to kind of understand or realize before they go into the field.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough, right? You definitely have to have the ability to take terrible things that happen in the world and not let it, you have to still have enough emotion where you connect with it. If it becomes nothing to you, then it's probably time to find another job.
Mhm.
But you do have to be able to compartmentalize it and come home and live a normal, functional life. Like, which I find that fairly easy to do most of the time, but for some things it's tough.
Sure.
I kept going back to the bridge collapse site every day, for months. My wife was pregnant. I dragged her down there. Now we look back, she's like, "What? You were?" I'm like, I don't know. I felt like I needed to physically connect with the site. So yeah, it was. Often other people's worst day is your best day. And
Mhm.
that is something that I never took lightly. It's a great honor and a privilege to be able to be the conduit for important information on the days that matter. It's sort of like being a firefighter in a way. Every day you go to work, and most of those days you're just kind of shining up the truck and getting ready. And then some days the call comes. And the same is true for journalism. Every story matters, but like most days you're just telling people what's going on. And then
Yeah,
some days they really need you. And so you have to be ready.
exactly. Good. Well, I don't want to cut you off, but it's gonna cut me off in a minute,
It's
and
going to cut us off.
I
Yes.
know. I'm like these. I guess the advantage to Zoom is I'm not taking up too much
That's right. That's
time
right.
with this
A
little
forced
commercial.
end.
Like
It's very
I have
good.
to keep it to that time frame, I guess. But I do appreciate your time, and you gave some really great insight for some new journalists, and I really appreciate having this conversation with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, and we do a lot of journalism. Our radio people, it's a great way to get into the business too. We hire young people and interns and all of that, and it is nice to still have journalists in a radio newsroom. That's pretty uncommon. I think it's us and NPR, and that's about it. So